Good morning, students. How is everyone doing? I guess it could be afternoon if you're watching this later in the day, but regardless, hope you're well. Um, so today's lecture is going to talk about a couple of very major events that are going to happen in the 20th century. Um, and one of them you definitely know, or you should be pretty well aware of. We do have some videos, obviously, just kind of going over this one as well. To start, we're going to talk about South Africa and what happened in South Africa because there was a major thing that's going to happen in South Africa. Now, most of you are familiar with the civil rights movement in the United States here. You're familiar with a guy named Dr. Martin Luther King and what he was able to do for civil rights here in America. Now, Dr. King was influenced, and if you remember, rewind back to Mohandas Gandhi. And when you talk about Mohandas Gandhi, Gandhi was a guy who used nonviolence, right? He used boycotts and things of that nature to try to affect change. Okay, so when you look at Dr. King and what he was able to do, he followed Gandhi. And then there was another gentleman that actually followed Dr. King. Okay, and that guy was named Nelson Mandela. And what happened in South Africa was something called the apartheid. So, like I said, you're probably familiar with segregation, this concept of a whites only beach and a colored only beach, or a whites only bathroom and a colored only bathroom. The whole bus system where whites sat in front of the bus and or colored people would sit in the back of the bus, right? That was called segregation. Well, South Africa had the same thing because don't forget, South Africa was controlled by Great Britain. Okay, so when you looked at Great Britain wanted to control South Africa 100%. And the people who lived in South Africa obviously didn't like this idea. They wanted their own rights, they wanted their own freedoms, just like Black people or African Americans in America during the Civil Rights Movement wanted equality, wanted their own rights. The people of South Africa, right, wanted the same thing. And tomorrow we'll kind of get into the very important leader of this movement. There's two, but the specific one is Nelson Mandela, and we'll get into him in an upcoming lecture. Okay, now there was a big trade agreement that's also agreed on during this time period, and that agreement was referred to as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now, this agreement has recently shifted under President Trump. This has been renegotiated. Um, and the concept here is that when you have sort of neighboring countries, you sort of work with this concept of free trade. All right, so in this case, you have America, you have Canada, and you have Mexico. And what you do with something like this, with a trade agreement like this, is you're allowing these countries to kind of trade with each other and have these agreements where you're not maybe doing certain tariffs or certain charges to a country based on this trade agreement. All right, so now NAFTA's recently shifted, like I said, and we won't get too much into the details, but they changed it based on, America putting in or not getting enough out of the deal, and whatever the case is, it was reworked, and it's been reworked that America kind of has more of a standing or came a little stronger based on the newer NAFTA deal. Okay, now something that really impacted, I know, my life personally, and something that you guys are very familiar with, even though none of you were born, you're obviously tremendously familiar with, was and is terrorism. Okay, specifically, we talk about the terror attacks on September 11th, 2001. All right, there's a world that exists prior to 9/11, and then there's a world that exists after 9/11. I can remember being young, being a teenager, going on planes. There was no such thing as sort of the metal detectors. There really was no thing that you were going through. Essentially, you just walked on the plane. I mean, there was one tiny law. I remember walking through Islip's airport, and there's one tiny little metal detector with one guard standing next to it, and you could pretty much just go right through, and you could carry certain things. I know my wife told me a story about bringing a samurai sword on a plane, and that seems crazy today. Um, but these were the things that could happen in a pre 9/11, because the concept of using a plane as a weapon was just not something that people had thought of. Planes had been hijacked, don't get me wrong. If you go through history, you'll see plenty of times where planes were hijacked in acts of terrorism. There's a famous Pan Am plane that got hijacked in an act of terrorism. But taking a plane and using it as a weapon had never been something that anybody had thought of prior to 9/11. So now, today, when you go through an airport, obviously you go through a tremendous amount of security, right? The Department of Homeland Security is created because of terrorism, right? When you like I said, when you go through the airport, you are screened. You go through these various things, and all of this happens because of 9/11. You can't bring certain liquids on the planes, right? You can't. You have to take your shoes off when you go through because somebody tried to put a bomb in a shoe one time. All right, all of these things are things that happen because of 9/11 and because of terrorism. And even more recently, when we've talked about ISIS, right? And and you guys in your lifetime have seen a lot of examples of terrorism acts by ISIS. Um, when you look at what ISIS has done, they've had mass shootings. They've kidnapped and killed people and things of that nature. All of these acts of terrorism are, well, like it says here, deliberate use of violence to gain revenge for political goals. Terrorism is something that, unfortunately, we're probably going to live with for a majority of our lives. And honestly, unfortunately, probably your children and your grandchildren are also going to live with acts of terrorism. Okay, these are things that aren't going to change easily. Because the problem with terrorism is there's not one person, right? So we know this guy right here. Okay, if you don't know him, that's Osama bin Laden. He's the guy who carried out, and his name's right there, he was the leader of Al Qaeda. He's the one who carried out the terror attacks on 9/11. And here's the thing, he had attacked the World Trade Center earlier. He attacked the World Trade Center in 93. He had tried to bomb it. And 8 years later, he came back with a much more deadly attack in 2001. So, fast forward, okay? Under Barack Obama, I believe it was 2011, if I remember correctly, Osama bin Laden is killed. Okay, he's captured, he's killed, however you want to look at it. But did terrorism stop because of the death of Osama bin Laden? The answer is no. Because even though they took out Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda lost power, ISIS formed after that. And we've seen, under Obama and under President Trump, that ISIS has lost a lot of its power. But does that mean that terrorism is going to stop? Probably not, unfortunately. Unfortunately, you're probably still going to see acts of terror over your lifetime. Because unfortunately, this is something that has gained a lot of power and has gained a lot of steam. And it's an unfortunate part of our lives moving forward. Now, a lot of terrorism, a lot of the reason why the Middle East really isn't a big fan of us, we'll actually get into that tomorrow when we talk about Israel and Palestine and the country of Israel and how we're dealing with that country and how it's been split up and stuff like that. But there was something that happened. So we'll get into that a little bit of why they didn't like us. But after we were attacked, we obviously, it was one of the few times that I can tell you in this country that there was an honest sense of unity among people. People came together. It didn't matter if you were a New Yorker or from California or Oregon or Texas or Kansas. None of that mattered. People came together, right? And there was a lot of solidarity post 9/11. I can remember, like I said, I remember getting up and watching this on the news. I was in college during this, and just not understanding it. But now you look back, you start to get it all. Post 9/11, we fought two very major wars, and they were in Iraq and Afghanistan. All right. The one in Iraq is the one we're going to look at now. And there's this guy right here, and we'll talk about him a little bit in tomorrow's lecture. Actually, no, I think it's in 2 days or whatever. Regardless, Saddam Hussein is the dictator of Iraq. Now, we had problems with Saddam Hussein before. Okay, there was something called Operation Desert Storm. So we had issues, and we'll get into Desert Storm in a little bit. We had issues with Saddam Hussein in the past. Now, we didn't take him out of power, essentially because we felt like we didn't want to have to disrupt and go into the country and essentially take it over. So we do leave him in power, but unfortunately in 2003, we start another war. Post 9/11, it's thought that A, he has weapons of mass destruction, and B, they're possibly hiding Osama bin Laden. Because of these things, America goes into Iraq. They take out Saddam Hussein, and essentially we fight a very long, drawn out war where we are trying to sort of stabilize Iraq. And the same thing is going to happen in Afghanistan. So these are very long, drawn out wars. And you may know people, you may have family members, you may have friends, you may know other people, family, friends, whatever the case is, who have fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. And these were extremely violent and bloody wars. And the thing about these wars is it wasn't like World War II, where you had sort of a face on the enemy. You know, here's Adolf Hitler, and once we take out Hitler, you know, the German war machine will be done. There was no real, you know, one target. Yes, Osama bin Laden was a target. He was a guy that they clearly wanted. But even taking him out didn't stop terrorism, and it didn't stop the wars. Okay, it's like a starfish. You know, you cut off one leg of the starfish, you know, it grows back. That was the problem with these things. They're very faceless enemies. It was like what we saw in Vietnam, where you just didn't know who the enemy was. So these become very, very long, drawn out wars. Okay, and they cost us a lot of money. Now, this is still a debate today. How do you deal with Iraq and Afghanistan? We've slowly removed ourselves from those areas. We have less of a presence today. But these are things that you're probably going to see in the news. And the Middle East is going to be a hotspot in your lifetime, in my lifetime, your lifetime, probably your children and your grandchildren are going to talk about the Middle East, places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, things of that nature, Jordan, Iran, you know, all of these places are still areas that we deal with today as hotspots in the world. All right, and that's today's lecture. Tomorrow, there's some video clips that we want you to watch. Tomorrow we'll get into the Middle East a little more. All right, guys, have a good day. And if you need anything, obviously email us. Or if you have questions, email us. This is Mr. Kitts signing off.